Flexibility is a risk management tool that I researched out at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. So this is a little roadmap. We'll just give a little background, a theoretical explanation, and then work through some examples, if that sounds good. All right, we need to define risk. Anybody have a off-the-cuff definition for me?
An outcome that you're not expecting or planning for.
That's a good one, yeah. Basically what we don't know, right? That's usually negatives are what we try to avoid, right? The negative side. But I would like to propose it is the possibility, right, of good or bad. So when we say manage risk, we're not always meaning take risk away, right? Here are some risk management strategies that my father and others put together a few years ago. I was happily able to work with one of the authors of this publication as my master's professor. So we can avoid the risk, transfer the risk outside of the operation, either through insurance or contracting, right? It's a way to outsource the risk to someone else. Controlling the risk usually involves some aspect of the probability that the risk will happen, or controlling the impact of the risks we can't control the probability of, like the weather, right? Can't do much about the weather, but we can control what we do to make the weather not as big of an impact on the operation. And so there's 3 different ways to control the impact listed here. Increase reserve capacity, maintaining flexibility, and that's where my thesis kind of focused in on, because it was the last piece that wasn't researched very well, but diversification is a well-known concept, and then number 4 is accept the risk. So this is where a lot of the impetus came for my research. We hear a lot of times, we want more flexibility. Flexibility is good. If I do this, it gives me more flexibility. And so we pose the questions, this option provides you more or less flexibility than what, right? What are we comparing it to? How much is enough, right? How much more flexibility does this action or this strategy give you? And then lastly, why is maintaining flexibility good, right? So basically, we set out to define flexibility, what it is, how much or lack of, right? How much is present or how much is not present, and then what is flexibility worth as a risk management tool. So through the literature review, we had to mine pretty deep. Most of the contributions came out of the manufacturing world, so pretty controlled environments, right? Like you think about an automobile manufacturer, you have inputs, maybe a supply chains coming in, have an assembly line, and then you have outputs, right? So it's very controlled. There was very few relative to those that came out of the agricultural world, and even fewer were very specific about what flexibility is. So these are some of the kind of high-level things we came up with. There's different contexts flexibility can act in, right? If it's a sort of a high level, we have management flexibility. You can see in the hierarchy, sometimes that can be built on lower level things, like having flexible equipment, flexible systems, right? Some of those lower level things can help leverage flexibility at a higher level. Another thing is time. A lot of people think of the strategic, operational, and then tactical management styles as kind of linked to time, mostly because they are impacting things over time, right? But we can make a decision today that's at an operational level that can have long-term impacts, right? That's impacting our strategy. But then sometimes you think about like planning, right? Especially at the beginning of the year. What's our strategy for this year, or strategy for the next 5 or 10 years? Flexibility isn't always tied to a specific time point, right? But it lastly, it can be proactive or reactive. So we can be outward looking, trying to be flexible, trying to, tailor our operation to avoid or take advantage of certain opportunities, right? Or if we're reactive, right, we're just kind of going along and then something happens and are we flexible or not? So kind of two different perspectives there. There's a lot of misconceptions, and the first one I want to address is that there is always a cost to flexibility. The graph on the right shows two firms, A and B, and it's basically unit cost of production over output. Generally, we want to drive unit cost of production as low as we can, right? So it increases the profit margin. But for these two firms, firm A is more flexible because they're able to produce two outputs and adjust the output depending on market conditions. Firm B is more specialized, so they're very honed in on one product. They can do it very well, so they've driven their unit cost of production down. But say if there's upheaval in that one output market, they're not as flexible in being able to shift production to a different output. More is not always better. This is kind of we think of flexibility as the prize, right? You've got a trophy for being flexible, but sometimes you can be flexible in one area and it's actually hurting you in not allowing you to be flexible in another area. So hopefully we'll see some of that as we go forward. And then I like to think of flexibility as a continuum. We think of a rigid system as not flexible, right? That's true, but there's also the other end of the spectrum where if you're hypersensitive to adjustments, you will be constantly changing and you won't be going forward in the things that are important to you, right? So we really want to try and narrow in on that stability that flexibility provides, right? Kind of that middle ground where you can adjust, right? But you're not flying all over the map. So these are some of the definitions that we kind of worked through. The old Merriam-Webster gives us some ability to adapt to new or different changing environments, requirements. There was surprisingly few definitions of what flexibility really is. So this is the one we hammered out, kind of stealing a little bit from here and there that we found where there were some definitions in the literature, but flexibility is really about the ability to switch. Think about a light switch, right? On, off. And it's very binomial, right? And then we want to be effective at it, right? So we don't want to incur a lot of cost or take a lot of time of doing that switch. So then moving on to the quantification, this is also very, very not very well researched area. But basically what it comes down to is, can you enumerate or count up how many options you have, right? And then the degree of freedom or choice is kind of based on every situation. So as we were talking through these flexibility kind of management styles, right? There's the ability to switch, and then there's the ability to recognize you need to switch, right? So you might be able to, but if you're in a contract, you're locked in, right? You can't switch if you're producing one crop and the market's bad, right? If you're locked in somehow, you won't be able to switch as a manager. So then you can kind of come up with some objective measures, like based on your equipment portfolio, can you do corn and soybeans? Well, switch the header on the combine, right? You could probably do that. As long as your planter will accommodate both kinds of seed, you could switch, right? And then subjective would be more situational dependent again, right? So that gets into personal emotions and kind of your likes and dislikes for certain things. And then doing a performance assessment, maybe you can do corn and soybeans, but maybe your situation, your ground might be more conducive to one or another, right? And then you can kind of just observe gives you an idea of how much flexibility you have. So if you don't have a lot of flexibility, you could see the cost of switching being high, or the time that it takes to switch being very high. Valuing flexibility is also very hard, but basically what we decided through kind of mining other researchers' assessments was it fits very well under the real options theory. So this is kind of the next leap beyond financial options, where you buy the option somehow, you exchange some monetary value for the ability to take some action. Usually it's buying or selling in the future, right? Think about the futures market with cattle. You can buy puts and calls. Gives you the option in the future to take some market action. So flexibility fits very well in there. One really easy to understand example is flex fuel cars. So you might go to the dealer and, well, we have this gas burner, or we have this one that does ethanol blends, right? The engine might be more costly to do a biofuel, so you have this trade-off in cost, right? Well, what's the likelihood that gas is going to be more expensive in the future versus ethanol? If you can see, based on market predictions and stuff, that ethanol is going to be very cheap, gas is going to be very expensive, you might consider buying the dual fuel car, right? If your situation is that gas is going to be the cheapest for the next foreseeable future, why would you buy the biofuel car that's more expensive, right? Do you really need the flexibility to switch to a different fuel source if the one that is solitary on gas, right, will always be the cheapest? So here's some other applied cases. Again, with the dual fuel boiler, they were looking at natural gas versus oil. Based on their situation and the market trends and prices at that time, they found that the dual fuel boiler was the most reasonable option as far as price point goes for fuels going forward. A parking garage example was very interesting because they had a certain demand in this city for parking spaces. They were going to build a structure, but the city planners were like, well, what about the future, right? What if we need more capacity in the future? We've already got this structure that has 200 spaces and that's it. So they looked at, well, what if we overbuild, right? So we'll have extra capacity going forward and we'll never run out, right? Well, that's adding cost, and you don't have the demand now, so you're kind of banking on having more demand later. What they ended up deciding was, we'll build a very robust structure for capacity now with the option of adding capacity later without having to deconstruct and build something new. Similarly, with an apartment building, they said, we have this demand now for dorm rooms because it was near a college campus in Australia. Then in the basement, they were going to put retail spaces. But, they don't want to get locked in, so they're like, well, what about making it so we can switch the rooms around so it's more like a dorm, or so it's not like a dorm, more like an apartment, right? Each unit would be kind of singled out, so you'd have the kitchenette, the room, bathroom, right, all in one unit, whereas in a dorm situation, it'd be kind of shared, right? And so they said, yeah, it makes sense. We don't know what the demand for dorm rooms is going to be in the future, and maybe down the road, this will be in the basement. At the first level, it might be better to have a co-working space instead of retail space. So they built in flexible walls and floor plates and a bunch of different technology to make that switch possible. So the very last one we have here, the ranch example, was probably the best one we found. This rancher in Texas has a hay meadow. They've been cutting it for hay for the past 20 years, but hay markets go up and down, right? Sometimes they need a little more grazing. But the hay meadow can't be grazed unless it's fenced. It didn't have a fence. So So they're analyzing whether it's worth it to have the flexibility in the future to graze or hay for the cost of the fence. That's buying the option, right? And in that case, they thought it was. And the more volatile the cattle and hay markets got, the more valuable that option became. So they decided, yeah, we'll cash out the 42 grand and put the fence around it. So back to these three different strategies for controlling the impact of risk. As we were talking through these, first they were all in their own category, right? We can understand diversification, right? We're cow-calf, we do some farming maybe, some hay, it's diversified. It's not just one enterprise. If we have resource reserves, that can be thought of, having an extra year's worth of hay in the stack, or having extra fuel on hand. Those are resource reserves. Sometimes extra capacity gets thrown in there. So having bigger equipment than you absolutely need so that you're able to get your harvest done in a very time-efficient way and avoid impacts of weather usually. And flexibility, right? We have this ability to switch hanging out over here. And as we talked about this, it became clear they're really more like this. There's areas of overlap, and there's areas of where each of these strategies are in isolation. So, if we take flexibility and resource reserves for an example, the overlap there might be, so we have this gas tank on our farm, right? We put gas in it, we pay for it every summer because we use a lot of gas, right? Well, do you put that gas in the four-wheeler, the pickup, the tractor? I mean, how many different things can you put it in, right? You have the ability to switch where that resource goes. Similarly, with flexibility and diversification, if you've got a crop rotation going, for example, you do corn and soybean, do you have the ability to switch how much you do each year, right? Maybe it's not every year we do all corn, all soybeans, maybe you can mix it up. And maybe the market is dictating that to you each year, right? So it's really interesting to kind of think about how all these tie together and complement each other. So to work through basically the case I had to build for my thesis, I decided to do very practical rotational grazing example. So we all know forage variation is volatile every year. That's an example of production risk. Growing conditions change every year, right? Sometimes we have a high flush of grass in the spring because we got good winter and spring moisture, peters out at the end of the summer, right? Maybe it's the other way around, get good fall moisture and we got good regrowth on some hay, meadows, or your range, right? You can hit stuff again. And then animal selectivity depends on each year, right? If we get lots of forbs, lots of clover, I mean, they're gonna change where they graze, right? And so that leads to this idea of flexible stocking rates. A lot of people think, the literature documents it as carrying basically cow-calf pairs below capacity and then flexing that demand with stockers, right? It's a very common example. So this is a very nice pie. It's usually how range managers like to think of it in the institutional world. So we're going to leave half of the forage as residue, 25% goes to grazers, 25% gets wasted, whether the wildlife eat it, insects eat it, gets trampled, what have you. So we're going to try to change this picture for drought scenarios. On the top, you can see on the left-hand column, peak standing crop, that's your total production. This was based on a Sandhills example, so it's a little bit higher than Wyoming usually, but not too far. So we've got almost 2,000 pounds of forage that we can take off at the ground, right, each summer. So we're going to allocate 25%, that's 469 pounds to our cow-calf, and residue for the plant growth later, and then insects get 25%. That's the top row, ideal situation, right? If we increase our forage harvest efficiency, we go down this column, take a little bit more, basically the waste goes away. There isn't any left for insects or wildlife. But we're still leaving the 50% residue, trying to protect the ground. And we're taking more and more pounds, right, for the cow-calf operation, but the peak standing crop doesn't change. In the bottom case, we have declining forage quantity. In the left-hand column, so we start at that same level at the beginning, and then we work down. It's a typical drought scenario, right? Decreasing forage quantity. It's probably easier to understand based on these graphs. So on the left, we have intake increasing as we modify forage harvest efficiency. We have the same amount of residue going all the way through, and then decreasing amount that we're leaving for insects and wildlife. If we're in a decreasing quantity situation like in a drought, we can modify forage harvest efficiency to take the same amount all the way through, leaving the same amount of 50% residue, and then decreasing what the insects and wildlife are able to take, right? So my argument was, if we cross-fence a pasture, we can move from maybe right here at 25% to right here at 35%. So we're not taking a lot more, but let's see how this works out. We implement a technology, cross-fencing in this example, and we're going to increase forage harvest efficiency by 10%. So not a lot, right? Just bump a little bit more. And so this is the kind of parameters we put around it. It's a one-section pasture, 1,800 pounds of forage per acre. We're going to try to carry 100 pairs for 150 days, so 5 months roughly. And then we have two scenarios, whether if forage is at 100% of average, so 10-year average, and then if forage is poor, so down to around 70% of average, and based on historical data, we said the likelihood of those happening is about 50-50. So 50% chance that we'll have enough forage, same as average years, 50% will have a decline. And then where the flexibility comes in is putting in cross-fencing. So if we take the example, we've got one square section pasture, water tank in the middle, we can install 2 miles of cross-fencing and rotationally graze. We can use either permanent fence or electric fence. If we purchase the permanent fence, we'll put in the 2 cross fences and make 4 160-acre pastures, right? But then it's going to be set that way, right? We won't be able to change it back. So the flexibility is, should we use electric fence to switch in bad years, take it out in good years? If we're taking a little bit more in bad years, doesn't make sense, right? 10%. But we'll see that 10% is enough to carry a lot when it comes to forage. So the idea is you can put temporary fence in, switch it any way you want in any year, but especially in years where forage is just a little bit short, right? So we have this triple benefit, right? There's less cost at the beginning, and you don't need as much because you can take it out and put it in, right? So 1 mile will make a quarter, whereas you need 2 miles of the permanent fence, and then it's easily removed, right? So this is the equation. The expected value, I don't expect you to understand all this, but basically to work through the math, we have an expected value that takes into a consideration the base land value, the forage value, all these different values to come up with what the value of these options are. So we have a no fence used, or permanent cross fencing, which will allow us to bump up to 35% harvest efficiency, or the temporary cross fencing, which will also allow that. Then you can see the premium for those options is around $2,000 per year for the permanent cross fencing, and then $600-700 for temporary fencing. So like I said, all these values go into this equation, changing the value of flexibility in the end. So, hopefully this is not too complicated. We have options A, B, and C. They each have an expected value. If we take the value of B minus C, we have the value of cross fencing, right? But in a rigid system, or non-flexible. If we take the value of C minus the value of option A, we have the value of cross fencing with the flexibility added. And so to isolate the value of flexibility, we have to take C minus B, because those are both gaining us the option of bumping harvest efficiency. But since C is the flexible one, that's where that value of flexibility is really built in. So isolate that out. We pull C minus B and get $2,400 in this case. Okay, so here we have on the vertical axis stocking rates, and then percent of average forage production on the horizontal axis. So here at the middle, it's 100% of average. If we go to the right, it's more than average. If we go to the left, less than average. So if we take this is really a continuum, but these lines kind of help us kind of put some benchmarks in, right? So if we take our 25% harvest efficiency like usual, that's at level 2, that's around 23 animal unit days per acre. If we bump it up, we'll go to this other line, line number 3, we can capture a little bit more. But if we stock at level 3, there's no risk protection built in, because we're stocked at full capacity basically, and there's no allowance for drought years. So instead, what we want to do is slide down line number 2. We're going to carry the same number of animal unit days per acre. We're going to arrive at this point here. So we don't have to destock, but we're capturing a little bit more out of each acre, right? Because we're able to cross fence and do that. The other scenario we could do, right, is stock light. We'd be down here at level 1. And so in good years, we got plenty, right? But we're not taking a full 25% off each acre. We can slide way down, even further down, right, than this point here. We can slide all the way down to here if forage production is down to like 60% of average. So there's definitely more risk protection built into stocking light. But the point we wanted to make was, if you implement cross fencing, you can keep the same number of acres, or the same number of cows, by just taking a little bit more off of each acre. These are the expected values. So each option, A again is no fence, B is with the rigid fence, and C is with the temporary cross fence. So as we get, so on the horizontal axis, this is probability of average or better forage. So down on the left, it would be very low likelihood of average, right? So we're thinking it's probably going to be pretty bad. On the right-hand side, though, it's very, very certain that we're going to have average forage. And so you can see the option to cross fence, which is number A, it increases as you get more probability that you'll have average forage. And then because of the probabilities involved, right? We said it was 50-50 that we're going to have good or worse than good. That That's just showing it again. So how many people have one of these? Anybody? No? Harbor Freight, you can pick them up for just under $155. Does this have flexibility built into it? Oh yeah. You got 3 different ball sizes and 4 different height options, right? And if you flip it over, you've got 4 more. If you need a ball raise, right? To have the same ability to switch all those different options, you have to buy 12 balls. How easy is that gonna be to carry around in the back of your pickup, right? But then on the other hand, maybe you only have 1 trailer. You're never gonna switch the ball, right? Why would you buy one that can do 12 different options when you only overhaul 1 trailer, right? Flexibility is something you don't always need. What about this one? Is this switch easy? Is it fast? Usually it involves a shop, right? And sometimes people go to a flatbed because they don't care for the box, right? It's personal preference. But this would be a non-flexible switch, right? Probably not gonna be doing it every other month, maybe even once a year, right? Like I said, in crop farming, there's lots of options for flexibility here. First of all, crop choice, right? In most cases, you can decide which crop's gonna be planted next year. You have that flexibility. If you do your contracting or your harvesting yourself versus contracted out, it might give you flexibility, might take some away, right? If you're relying on the contractor to do your harvesting, you're waiting for their schedule to work out for your field, right? But it gives you flexibility to do something else during harvest. Maybe you have a cow-calf or backgrounding operation, you're booked during harvest, and you're just don't have enough hours in the day, right? So it's just some things to keep in mind. If you do it yourself, right, you have the flexibility to switch harvest day. Well, it doesn't work for me today, do it tomorrow, right? You have that flexibility. Marketing date is another really, really good opportunity, and that requires storage. If you don't like the price at the elevator today, put it in the bin. You can take it next year, 2 months from now, you know? But the problem with storage, right, if you don't have any, you gotta pay to get it. So, you're buying the option to have that flexibility. Similarly with your typical cow-calf operation, we can count up the number of this is just marketing flexibility, right? You can go to the sale barn, right? If you live nearby, that's an easy option. But you'd have maybe twice the flexibility if you added an option, right? You can do future options or video sale. You could add direct-to-consumer marketing. It's another market channel, right? You can switch production outputs depending on what is best for you. You can decide to put them into a backgrounding operation. If you do it in-house, that adds cost, right? But you have the flexibility to hold them, either backgrounding or feedlot, market them later. Maybe markets will improve. Maybe you'll get some contract you've been waiting on, but now's not the right time to pull the trigger and send a sale barn, right?
I don't know.
What about this?
I don't know, prices are pretty good.
They are, right? Maybe you don't care. You can send it out. The machine on the left does one operation, right? And that's cut hay. Very well. The machine configuration on the right is a little more flexible. Because, well, maybe you need to pull a rate with that tractor because you're putting up contract hay, right? You travel around with your equipment. Each machine has to do more than one thing. This machine would even be more flexible if it had a loader on it, right? Like, it can do more things. You can switch what that machine's used for. What about this? you can haul hay with both machines, right? But if you're gonna try and clean pens with a four-wheel drive tractor, it's a little difficult. You gotta turn on a dime, get up close to the bungs, be really precise, right? So maybe you need the flexibility of both machines. Maybe you can get away with one. As far as each machine respectively, right, you can switch the implements on the front. There's flexibility within each machine, but maybe you need the flexibility that the other machine will provide that one won't give you, right? Here's another common example, right? Pay double the price for a flatbed, but you have the flexibility to feed hay with it. Something we might not think about, but you know, if you need the flexibility to feed with your pickup and haul a trailer later, bale bed's the way to go, right? Versus, you can pay less, put that on the back of the tractor. Does that decrease your flexibility? Maybe. The top scenario is probably more flexible than the bottom, right? It's more hoses to hook up, machine to get in and out. But what if you did this? Add the $500 quick attach. Suddenly, the bale handler on the top becomes more flexible, right? It's easy to take off, go haul something else. If you got multiple chores to do during the day. Here's another one, right? We have a dedicated machine on the right, a flexible machine on the left. Sometimes you got to bale hay, rake hay, stack hay, right? The loader tractor gives you a lot more flexibility than a dedicated machine. So these are some key just takeaway points. Flexibility allows you to switch between option A, B, or however many, right? Into infinity. We can count how many options to quantify flexibility. You need at least one, right? I mean, if you're gonna switch, you gotta go somewhere else than where you're at, right? So you gotta have at least one option to be flexible. Real options theory is probably the best way that we can value flexibility in a system. And then I think you've probably picked this up, but flexibility is not the thing we should all achieve, right? It's gotta be tailored to a specific risk, specific scenarios. Some people need more flexibility than others to be profitable. So I'd like to open the floor. If you've got discussion points, questions, anything, let's have a conversation about this. Questions? My professor told me at the time, this is cutting edge research. I agree. It took some mental gymnastics, but what do you think? Does this make sense in line?
Oh, yeah.
Flexibility is something we build into almost without thinking about our lives, right? Like, you show up at the gas station, gas pumps are down. Like, where can you go? Where can you switch to get your gas, right?
I think these are things that go through producers' minds all the time, but nobody's ever really quantified. And that's probably
Yeah, I think
accurate
what I would
statement.
say is, Vince is bringing up is, flexibility is sort of the default way that we operate in much of agriculture. I mean, your example of the balls is a great one, except that you didn't offer the option of making do, right? You pull the trailer with the ball that's not 4 inches. 4 inches too high, and you can get it there, right? You go slow or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think the challenge, as you raised, that flexibility isn't in question. I think it's a goal of everyone, pretty much as Vince says, every day. The trick or the challenge is figuring out the cost and or the possibility of trade-offs and valuing what those trade-offs are in a realistic, timely framework where we do it by the seat of our pants oftentimes, but is your example the baler goes, it's power unit can be hooked up to other implements, but the baler is a dedicated baler, so only a piece of that system is flexible. And what's the trade-off there? Well, the other system isn't flexible, so,
Right.
or your cutting machine, for example, as well, you know, that the swather is dedicated. But you didn't show examples of that, and that I think is what if I was a producer, would be more interested in hearing you tell me about a little bit more. What should I take into account? So, you know, the cost of capital being tied up, the opportunity cost, we call it, right? Or the actual financial cost, because obviously some machines and some of the flexibility has a known price tag up front. But then there are trade-offs down the way that we are also making. So valuing all of that is challenging, but it's also the kind of question I think we would, if we were really gonna build it into our decision-making process every day, we need to know.
Well, and with that too, a lot of times your more specialized units have a lower operating cost associated with them. Like we have self-propelled balers, and they're way cheaper to run than a tractor or baler.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so there's things like that too, where hyper specialization can lower your cost versus a more flexible unit. And what do you need? Do you need a lower cost of operating, or do you need that loader tractor? Those are other things to consider as well.
Right.
Or even increasing
We look-
efficiency, right?
We look at things as contingencies because we get feeding a lot of cattle and things, and I want a second option and a third option and all, because an option of not feeding thousands a day is not good, so
Right.
we have backup things. And one example, at our place, we normally run a couple self-propelled swathers, and I had we were getting high-hour heads on some, so I found a very clean head. It was a New Holland, and I bought the thing, and it had a bidirectional hook to it. And bidirectionals are kind of morphodite, kind of from back in the days of the tubeless tubes. But I found out that they were stopping making the bidirectionals, and we found one of those very last years that they were made, and we bought that to give us an option, and I'll be son of a gun if,
4 hours on anything else.
yeah, well, one of our swathers went down in New Holland, and all these companies are using different companies for their electronics, and they lost a monitor. Well, they never had any way to do parts on anything, and they would not turn anything loose for like Pertec to build anything. There was an outfit through Canada and through France. And they decided, oh yeah, we'll fix that now. But Fremont County had 8 of them down. And one year when all of a sudden it happened, there was 8 of them down in Fremont County. And of course with dealers anymore, you can't just go rent one or buy one. So we wound up with a swather on that thing for an entire year. We have a loader on it, which it's not as good as commercial loaders, but we can get by with it. And I'll be a son of a gun if we don't, what he said, we put more hours on that thing than anything else in the year.
Yeah.
Just because it's wherever we need to fill in. We put a dozer on it and put it on the silage pile. We do all kind of things that way, and it wasn't intended that way, but the good Lord just kind of led us into it.
Yeah.
And it's
Got lots of
very
options.
nice to have backups, feeding operations, whatever, you know, we got 2 main feeders, and when one goes down, we have a third just in case, because we're kind of, we can't depend on like dealers or anything like that like you used to in the old days.
Well, and a lot of times, if you have a machine that's maybe higher in hours, but it's still working, right? You want to upgrade, there's relatively low cost to keeping the old unit, right? As a backup, as parts, if you need them, right? So sometimes that flexibility can be, like, you still value having that option, but maybe you don't value it enough to buy 2 units and get rid of the old one, right?
Right.
Spare is a good insurance.
And we run similar equipment, we try to stay in similar lines and stuff for parts, serviceability, things like that, and kind of a fleet mentality, I guess. So,
But then going back to the more subjective options evaluation, right? Your relationships with each dealer impact your decision making, right? It's situationally dependent on you. Nobody else has the same relationships or connections
that's the main thing with the point of your research there, when you start trying to pin it down, like John was saying, when you start trying to quantify everything, that's where it gets tough, and I don't think there's been a lot of work that way. In the back of our minds, we're trying to do that, but it's a by the seat of your pants kind of thing very often.
You see some numbers stuck to it, and that there is an impact just besides what you justify in your mind. That's cool to see that, hey, what I'm rationalizing here, there's something to this, you know, and seeing it on
And
paper.
in my case, it was easy, right, because it was a positive value. You could pay too much for flexibility,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And it would be the same as paying too much insurance premium.
Well,
or
you talk about
something
options,
else, right?
options are always the second best value. I mean, it's because it's an expense in there, so how do you weigh that?
Right. Any other thoughts?